Okay.
So Ronnie, should we start now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure. Welcome to the 5th Southeast Asia Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Sustainable Development, and this is the session 6, discussing RCEP and the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Investment. The conclusion of the RCEP is a major achievement of Asian countries in regional economic integration. RCEP is a mega FTA among all ASEAN member states and 5 major economies in the region. And in the same time, all RCEP members are pledged to the attainment of the SDGs incorporated in the 2030 Agenda. And in light of this, it is of great policy importance and academic interest to discuss how countries and other stakeholders, especially Southeast Asian countries, can use the RCEP, especially the investment chapter and the investment facilitation provisions of the RCEP in their efforts in promoting sustainable investment. And session 6 is dedicated to this very timely topic. We're very honored to have a great line of speakers from different backgrounds to explore this issue. And my name is Manjel Chi, and I'm very happy to be the moderator of today's session. So the first on the agenda, let me first of all invite Mr. Ruimat Surakosuma, Head of Sub-Regional Office for Southeast Asian, ESCAP, to provide a very brief recap of Session 1 to Session 5 of this forum. So Ronnie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Chi. Papa Yus Diman Saman, Acting Assistant Director at the Trade Division, Ministry of Finance and Economy, Brunei Darussalam. Kun Tintip Subadich, Chief of Investment and Enterprise Development, Trade, Investment and Innovation Division at ESCAP. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, colleagues, a pleasant morning and good afternoon. I'm Ronnie Surakusuma, Head of the Sub-Regional Office for Southeast Asia at ESCAP. May I welcome all of you to the 5th Southeast Asia Multi-Stakeholder Forum. The Southeast Asia SDG Forum, as it is called in short, provides an opportunity to take stock of progress on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to share perspectives and priorities from Southeast Asia in particular. The forum consists of 6 sessions, which started with 5 sessions on the 28th to the 30th of September, with the 6th taking place today. The forum addressed the main challenges for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, to discussing ways of unlocking the means of implementation to overcome these challenges and scaling up action. The event brought together stakeholders from government, parliaments, academia, the private sector, and civil society in an enabling environment for knowledge sharing. Topics deliberated included the regional SDG agenda for both the Asia-Pacific and Southeast Asia, the sharing of experiences on the voluntary national reviews of Southeast Asian countries, the showcasing of innovative projects and that promote women economic empowerment, and the strengthening of green growth through sustainable finance. Without a doubt, the COVID-19 pandemic represents one of the most profound challenges to economic, social development in our region and beyond. Even before COVID-19, countries needed acceleration across the board to successfully reach the goals by 2030. The pandemic has shown us that despite decades of work, the region's connectivity and social infrastructure remains fragile. We have witnessed major disruptions in cross-border economic and social activities. The pandemic has also brought into focus areas for improving the region's resilience. The intersection of disease, disaster, and climate change has tripled the risks we are facing. To break this cycle of disaster, vulnerability, and poverty, a shock responsive system will not be enough. We need systems that can help provide resilience against the expanding risks. ESCAP estimate shows that an adequate regional response would cost around $270 billion US or 0.9% of regional GDP. The ongoing pandemic-induced crisis has also underscored the importance of harnessing multilateral partnerships in our recovery plans and programs. The collaboration of government, private sector entities, think tanks, and other stakeholders at the country and region levels help to build strong partnerships, locally driven innovation and leadership, which are all key to supporting and to making tangible progress in the SDGs. This is particularly the case for voluntary national reviews, where South-to-South cooperation and support twinning of VNR countries is an excellent way to share expertise and lessons about the VNR processes and SDG implementation. We learned that member states and various stakeholders were able to share tips and advice to other countries and their counterparts about how to get the most impact from their VNR and how to involve stakeholders in a meaningful way. We also learned that if initiatives are to have any significant impact, they must have the dual task of addressing the pandemic as well as making concrete progress in the 2030 agenda. The APEC Putrajaya Vision 2040 and its implementation plan, for example, addresses several SDGs through the economic drivers of trade and investment, innovation and digitalization, and sustainable and inclusive growth, while it sets to build the foundation of the economies for a recovery. Obviously, more can be done to mainstream the SDGs at both the project and policy levels, and in the national and regional contexts. For instance, ESCAP Canada projects showcase that the links between policies or initiatives and the SDGs can be explicitly mapped as early as the design and consultation stages and continuously monitored and reported thereafter. In the area of sustainable finance, ASEAN countries issuing debt through innovative and sustainable instruments such as green, social, or sustainable bonds face known challenges. These include alignment with recognized standards and how to attract international investors to bond issued from ASEAN countries, and how to access international markets and how to list them on international exchanges and meet their listing requirements. To overcome these challenges, it is important to identify ways to align bond issuances with recognized standards and principles and follow best market practices. As the public sector is not in a position to finance the SDGs and climate change mitigation alone, public-private partnership is a good solution. So these are, of course, only some of the key takeaways from the previous sessions. All the materials have been uploaded onto our website, and I invite everyone to visit unescap.org/Southeast Asia. For this upcoming session, we look forward to listening to valuable insights and views on sustainable investment in the region and discuss on building back better from COVID-19 while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you, and I return the floor to Manjiao.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for this very helpful recap of what has been discussed in the first through the fifth sessions of this forum. I believe they will be very helpful for us in discussing our session. So now I would like to invite Ms. Tientip Sabhani, Chief IEDS TIID UNESCAP, to deliver introductory remarks. Tientip, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Ruhimat Sakasa Samad, Head Sub-Regional Office for Southeast Asia, UNESCAP. Mr. Yastiman Saman, Acting Assistant Director at the Trade Division, Ministry of Finance and Economy, Brunei. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say good afternoon and greetings from Bangkok. I'm very glad to see all of you today because we are in one of the most challenging times. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed much of Asia Pacific's progress on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It has also uprooted economic globalization, shocking global and regional supply chains, and disrupting international trade, foreign direct investment, and infrastructure development. The pandemic and associated lockdown measures resulted in global FDI flows falling by 35% in 2020. Developed countries, particularly in Europe and North America, recorded the most dramatic declines in FDI. Developing countries in Asia Pacific were relatively more resilient. FDI flows to developing Asia actually growing by 4% last year. The severity of the pandemic's impact on FDI flows have, however, varied by sub-region. For example, while FDI inflows to both North and Northeast Asia and South Asia grew due to the positive growth in both China and India, FDI collapsed by 31% in Southeast Asia and 25% in North and Central Asia. On the bright side, FDI flows have started to rebound in certain sub-regions and sectors in 2021. Data from the first half of this year suggests that inflows to both Northeast Asia and ASEAN countries were actually up 25% over the same period last year. Ladies and gentlemen, for the infrastructure sector, the pandemic has put pressure on government finances as focus is diverted to immediate financial measures, as well as delays in infrastructure project pipelines. However, favorable long-term financing conditions in global markets combined with government stimulus packages have boosted investor appetite and flows into infrastructure projects. Still, investment in sustainable infrastructure projects and sectors remain low and fragile, particularly in RCEP signatory countries. The road to sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic will certainly be long and gradual. FDI and public-private partnership will have an important role to play as public financing will remain tight in the recovery period. FDI and infrastructure investment can help boost our region's economic growth, support employment, and catalyze sustainable transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, getting back to pre-COVID-19 conditions will take time. Cross-border business ties need to be re-established. Appropriate projects need to be identified to attract investors and convince them to stay and even expand. Lower level investment will also likely lead to heightened competition for investment among our region's economies. Recognizing this, decisive policy action that ensures investment is channeled into priority sustainable development sectors has never been more critical. In this context, today's session on how RCEP can be used to boost sustainable investment and infrastructure development, I believe, is very timely. Ladies and gentlemen, RCEP offers significant opportunities for strengthening economic recovery and boosting investment and infrastructure development in signatory countries. Together, RCEP and the complementary competitive and locational advantages among signatory countries provide a compelling business case to encourage investors to direct their cross-border investment into RCEP countries. Economic cooperation among these countries could enhance access to finance for large-scale green infrastructure and investments. Ladies and gentlemen, therefore, the question here today are how can RCEP boost the prospect of sustainable cross-border investment and infrastructure development? And what do countries need for this to happen? Our session today will focus on making inroads into answering these important questions. For this, I encourage the presenters, distinguished panelists, and the audience to consider the following 4 issues during the session. First, as RCEP is a living document, how can it tangibly improve over time to boost more sustainable cross-border investment and infrastructure development? Second, with with the RCEP investment chapter, which provisions provide the most viable opportunities for linking on to the 2030 agenda and boosting investment in SDG sectors. Third, in what ways can economic cooperation among RCEP countries strengthen project finance possibilities for investors and encourage more bankable, sustainable infrastructure projects? Finally, the needs of RCEP countries will differ as both developing and least developed countries are RCEP signatory countries. So what types of regional and national support can best respond to the needs and build the capacity of government and private sector investors looking to invest? Last but not least, I would like to say that, of course, ESCAP stands ready to support RCEP signatory countries in implementing RCEP and utilizing it to enhance sustainable investment and infrastructure development in the region. I very much look forward to our fruitful discussion and wishing you all the best for today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very, very informative and very helpful, especially the 4 questions that are really insightful. And I believe that in the next around 2 hours, we will discuss these issues and hopefully we will come up with some ideas. So now I would like to invite Mr. Yusdiman Saman from Brunei, Darussalam, to deliver an opening remark. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ruhimat Surukusuma, Ms. Tientip Subanich, and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, let me just convey this regards from my director, Ms. Norzerlina Mumil, who is not able to be with us today due to her prior commitment. She also sent her appreciation to the ESCAP for this for the honor and the invitation to this auspicious event. So, distinguished officials, ladies and gentlemen, as Rohimat and Ms. Tin, the pinch of the COVID-19 pandemic severely impacted the economic activities and disrupted global socio-economic order on a scale that has never before seen in this modern world. However, despite this situation, we marched on. Great efforts were made to complete the negotiations for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which led to its signing in November last year. The RCEP, as we call it, signed among 15 countries, covers about a third of the world's population and contributes about 50% of global GDP, will broaden and deepen economic ties between the parties and provide new opportunities for producers and businesses, especially in terms of market access, given the level of liberalization for trade in goods, services, and investments. The implementation of the RCEP, which is expected to be in January next year, is expected to boost the region's value chains and contribute to a more inclusive and sustainable post-pandemic economic recovery process. The RCEP provisions related to market access and disciplines in trade, services, and e-commerce are highly relevant for regional value chains and market-seeking investment. RCEP countries are important FDI destinations. And as a similar question posed by Ms. Tientip just now, the challenge now is how are we going to attract and channel investment to relevant sustainable sectors, which will be crucial for rebuilding and improving our economic recovery efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, just for further information, to further facilitate ASEAN's recovery efforts, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, the SCRF we call it, and its implementation plan was adopted by the ASEAN leaders during the 37th ASEAN Summit on 12 November 2020. The SCRF, which includes 5 broad strategies, serves as ASEAN's consolidated whole-of-community exit strategy to emerge more resilient and stronger from the COVID-19 crisis. One of the key priorities under the SCRF is to promote sustainable and responsible investment in recognition that properly managed and implemented sustainable investment will improve economic and social resilience to future shocks. In line with this priority, the Coordinating Committee on Investment is expected to explore initiatives to promote investment that contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a possible ASEAN guidelines on sustainable investment. In addition, ladies and gentlemen, another key priority under the SCRF is to streamline and expedite investment process and facilitation and joint promotion initiatives by exploring the development of a regional initiative to facilitate investment into ASEAN. Having said that, I am pleased to share that ASEAN has adopted the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework during the 53rd ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting in early September this year, which sets out principles and actions to facilitate the inflow of investment into the region as ASEAN steps up its efforts towards post-pandemic economic recovery. Furthermore, as part of the CCCI's 2016 to 2025 investment work program, the CCI has organized the Forum on Sustainable Investment in ASEAN, which will be held tomorrow, in fact, and the day after. The forum aims to exchange information and best practices on initiatives to promote sustainable investment, including a report on sustainable investment in ASEAN, improve our capacity to develop better policies towards sustainable investment, and capitalize on existing frameworks, such as the RCEP agreement in attracting, promoting, and facilitating sustainable investment. I hope that this will be the beginning of future collaboration as we work together towards more resilient, robust, and sustainable economies. So with that, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to fruitful discussions during this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saman. Thanks for the very warm opening remark. And you already mentioned that ASEAN countries have taken great efforts, especially in facilitating investments for the development of sustainable investment. So we will see how ASEAN countries in this session we discuss would better use RCEP and other instruments to achieve this goal. So without further ado, let me now turn to our presenters. Our first presenter is Ms. Heather Taylor-Strauss, Economic Affairs Officer, IEDS TID of ESCAP. So Heather, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Manjao. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see? Okay. Yes, okay. So thank you for having me to discuss today how RCEP can be better leveraged to boost sustainable FDI. My presentation today is going to have 5 parts. First, I'm going to talk about what sustainable FDI is. Then we'll go into how we can measure sustainable FDI. Then I'll talk about some of the FDI trends in RCEP signatory countries before turning to how RCEP can boost sustainable FDI. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on how ESCAP can support RCEP signatory countries in boosting sustainable FDI. So before we jump right in, let me just make sure that all of the audience is on the same page with us when we talk about FDI. So what is FDI? Well, it's a cross-border investment with the objective of obtaining a lasting interest in enterprise in a foreign country. Lasting interest is typically defined as a 10% threshold of voting power in the invested enterprise of a host economy. So how can FDI contribute to the 2030 agenda and to sustainable development? Well, FDI is a principal means of financing the 2030 agenda. It's and the corresponding 17 SDGs. It's recognized in Goal 17 as a means of implementation, and it's also recognized as a vital component of financing the 2030 agenda in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So by ESCAP measurements, Asia and the Pacific needs an additional 1.5 trillion annually to finance the SDGs. And that measurement was actually taken in 2019. So 1.5 trillion has probably grown over the past 2 years due to the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. And the resources to fund the SDGs are enormous, and it's going to require both public sector resources, complemented by private sector resources. And private sector resources include FDI. FDI can contribute to sustainable development in a number of ways. It can help expand access to markets. It can bring in foreign exchange. It can contribute to skills development. It can contribute to technology transfer and increasing competition in local markets. It can also help boost indigenous industry growth. So recognizing this, in recent years, the term sustainable FDI has become quite popular. So what is sustainable FDI? Well, put simply, it's FDI that contributes to sustained economic growth. It is socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and follows responsible business conduct and does contribute to sustainable development. That being said, we do need to make a distinction between three different types of sustainable FDI. So first, there's sustainable investment projects, so to say, such as investment in solar energy, renewables, waste management. Then there's investment that takes place in a sustainable way and has spillover effects that can contribute to sustainable development, such as investments that lead to sustainable jobs. Then there are investments that help countries achieve the SDGs. When we talk about projects that can help contribute to achieving the SDGs, we can look at some priority sectors for SDGs and where FDI would be most relevant. And here we've got a list of some of those sectors. We've got power, transport, telecommunications, water and sanitation, food security and agriculture, climate change mitigation and adaptation, ecosystems and biodiversity, health, education. And basically the goal would be to, promote and attract and facilitate FDI in these sectors, which all correspond to SDGs. So when we talk about attracting and promoting FDI in those sectors, how do we actually measure how FDI can contribute to those sectors? How is it contributing to sustainable development? Well, we can look at a few different angles. In the economic angle, we can look at its contribution to GDP growth, net exports, employment, etc. In the social dimension, we can look at its contribution to skills development, community development, how much it's promoting women and disadvantaged groups' employment. At the environmental level, we can look at the level of environmental pollution of FDI flows, the level of GHG emissions, the level of energy efficiency and water consumption of FDI projects. Key is most of these measurements here, these impact measurements, they're looking at macroeconomic impact of flows. So they're looking at the flow level at a country level. So continuing on that, there have been a couple of different projects in the past few years to look at how we can measure FDI's impact. The first was by Carl Savant and Howard Mann, which outlines basically what the characteristics are of FDI that is sustainable. And this is kind of at a firm level and a country level, what FDI looks like by investors that is sustainable. The next is the OECD's FDI Qualities Project. And this is really a macroeconomic tool that will help provide an assessment of FDI flows into countries and how they are sustainable and how they can be more relevant for sustainable development. And this is an ongoing initiative of the OECD, and it's actually going to be presented again in the ASEAN Sustainable Investment Forum tomorrow as well. Finally, we've got indicators that we've developed at UN ESCAP. And our indicators differ from the previous two I've mentioned because we're looking really at a project level. So we are trying to assess the implications of an individual project against the sustainable development priorities of a country. So how much one particular investment project really can impact sustainable development priorities of a country. And these indicators are particularly relevant for investment promotion agencies. So moving on, let's talk about what the trends have been in RCEP countries on FDI. So in terms of RCEP, there's a lot of potential to boost FDI in signatory countries, especially intra-RCEP FDI flows. So in 2020, RCEP accounted for 24% of global FDI flows, and 30% of that was intra-RCEP flows. In comparison, 40% of all ASEAN flows are intra-ASEAN. So there stands quite a bit of room to actually boost that intra-RCEP FDI flow. As you can see here, inflows and, I'm sorry, my presentation has just been taken off the screen. Let me pull it back up. Can everyone see again? Yes, okay. Inflows and outflows from RCEP countries have remained relatively stable during the pandemic. They've actually only declined mildly in 2020 by 9% for the inflows and by 20% for OFCI outflows. FDI flows to and from China have been significant in helping to stabilize much of those flows within RCEP countries. Looking at ASEAN in particular, ASEAN member states saw a decline of 13% to 135 million of FDI inflows, and the largest contractions were actually in Thailand and Malaysia. On the outflows side, FDI has actually started to rebound in ASEAN countries, with Laos and Malaysia and the Philippines all registering strong growth in their inward investment. Looking ahead, boosting intra-regional FDI flows is going to be really key to recovering from COVID in RCEP countries, and also into making headway into achieving the 2030 agenda in RCEP signatory countries. Signaling how much RCEP can contribute to boosting sustainable investment, already nearly 70% of the FDI going into RCEP countries is actually in sustainable sectors, in infrastructure, renewable energy, water and sanitation, healthcare, and food and agriculture. So what can RCEP do, or how can RCEP actually boost sustainable investment? Well, RCEP actually already includes references to the dimensions of sustainable development within the agreement. However, there's still much scope to increase the extent to which it can boost sustainable FDI. Particular, I'm going to focus on three different areas. So first, there's positive room for it to include more of a sustainable development dimension because it's a living document. So there's room to include more sustainable development provisions, which is key to it. The agreement already includes an investment chapter. However, there needs to be more sustainable development oriented provisions included into that investment chapter. As it stands right now, the investment chapter, or Chapter 10 of the agreement, it consolidates much existing provisions. The chapter consolidates existing market access and among the parties as previously contained in many numerous bilateral agreements. It includes a most favored nation treatment clause, commitments on the prohibition of performance requirements, a schedule of reservations and non-conforming measures that allow for a negative approach, a framework for supporting efforts to liberalize investment, and also several investment facilitation provisions. The chapter doesn't include any provisions on investment protection or non-discrimination, or on ISDS, investor-state settlement dispute. However, there is room over the next 5 years to address those issues. So key is there's three areas that RCEP, our proposal that RCEP could really help boost sustainable FDI is, by looking at it as a living document to incorporate more sustainable development oriented provisions within the investment chapter in particular, and by also focusing more on the investment facilitation provisions. And here we would emphasize really looking at how to increase the transparency, predictability of investment regimes, and also streamlined administrative procedures. Indeed, these three aspects are also very much in line with some of the discussions going on right now in the WTO on investment facilitation for development. What is needed to work on these three fronts? Well, first, more provisions towards enforceability of the sustainable development provisions within the agreement are needed. Second, mechanisms for investment cooperation need to be incorporated within the agreement. And thirdly, RCEP needs a secretariat with a focal point on investment. So looking ahead, how can ESCAP support RCEP signatory countries in using RCEP to boost sustainable investment? Well, we can see ESCAP offering support in a couple of different ways. First, we can help provide capacity building on how to incorporate more sustainable development-oriented investment provisions within Chapter 10 on investment. Second, we can provide technical assistance on investment facilitation. Here, we can help really outline what some of the gaps are in signatory countries on investment facilitation in those key areas that I mentioned. So on transparency, predictability, and administrative procedures. And we can help support national reforms by doing gap analyses and help develop national action plans on investment facilitation. RCEP can actually help then boost, cooperation on investment facilitation at a regional level in these areas. Third, we can provide more technical assistance on sustainable FDI indicators. And this really refers to those FDI indicators that I mentioned that we've developed at ESCAP. And this also will help reinforce much of the work that is being proposed within ASEAN on developing sustainable investment guidelines. Next, we can offer an intergovernmental platform for dialogue and exchange on how to define what sustainable investment is within RCEP signatory countries, but also on how to boost sustainable investment within RCEP signatory countries. And here I can really see how this could happen through building investment cooperation mechanisms using ESCAP's intergovernmental platform to boost investment opportunities and awareness among them. So here, just throwing these out there, there could be two proposals. One would be on creating a RCEP sustainable investment opportunity platform. And this could actually happen through a web portal that, once RCEP Secretariat is created on their web platform, a sustainable investment portal could actually be developed on the platform that actually outlines what some of the investment opportunities are within RCEP signatory countries. Second, a RCEP sustainable supplier platform could also be incorporated into the RCEP web portal. And here Cambodia has actually, with the help of WEF, created a sustainable supplier platform on their IPA's website. And something similar could be created across RCEP signatory countries on the web portal. So with that, these are some proposals to think about going ahead as to how ESCAP can support. I look forward to the panelists' feedback as well as the audience's feedback on these initiatives, as well as the other aspects of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather, for bringing up the issue of the importance of RCEP to sustainable investment and also the areas where further needs and efforts should be made. Thank you very much. Now, let me invite our second presenter, Mr. Eric Roder, Coordinator IEDS TIID of ESCAP. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manjiao, and greetings to all. I'm very honored to join this conference today. So thank you for also putting up my my slides. So let's just jump right away to the next slide on the objectives of our infrastructure financing and PPP network for Asia and the Pacific. What does it do? Well, the network supports countries to develop PPP projects and infrastructure financing strategies that contribute to regional connectivity and sustainable development. And it does this through assisting in developing infrastructure regulatory frameworks, implement sustainable and resilient infrastructure policies, and showcase demonstration projects. It also works to disclose infrastructure project pipeline and regulatory framework in member states to facilitate transaction matchmaking. Exchange domestic and global best practices that fosters capacity building and development of successful pilot projects. The network aims to be a bridge between Asia Pacific countries and global investors. Next slide, please. So currently, our network members are spread throughout the Asia Pacific as well as in North America and Africa. Next slide. Okay, so our network members are made up of member states, development partners, as well as academic institution, and includes some 20 plus private sector companies that are part of the membership. So next slide, please. So what is our current work? So currently the network showcases early stage and pilot demonstration infrastructure projects from countries around the ESCAP region. Currently we have some 23 projects from 19 countries. 5 network meetings collaborating with the governments of China, the Philippines, and Kazakhstan. Next slide. So some of the areas that the network covers. Well, we try to look at ways of advancing healthcare infrastructure to ensure that no one is left behind. The ability of ICT systems to withstand and recover from and change in the face of external shocks. Build ICT infrastructure redundancy, such as through innovations like Li-Fi. And then in the area of disaster risk reduction, we look at how infrastructure can contribute to cyclone risk mitigation, infrastructure such as seawalls and mangroves, augmenting tsunami monitoring and so forth. With proper data, we can provide, we can arm engineers, for example, to develop better seawalls. So also we look at infrastructure that reduces stress on water resources, cope with drought, as well as mitigating land degradation and desertification. So further, funding for infrastructure also means financing projects that, for example, undertake coastal zone mapping to study, to look at storm surge and tsunami inundation, which affect coastal zones, and how to develop better evacuation plans, support engineering projects, as I mentioned earlier. So to move ahead, we are developing guidelines that will serve countries, and I will touch on that a little bit later. So next slide. So one example of our work is looking at telemedicine. Why are we looking at telemedicine? Because we want to make infrastructure projects more resilient and sustainable, thus bankable. We want to be able to help countries to attract investors. So one area that we were looking at was in telemedicine, and this is why are we doing this? Because we want to move from in a rural area, it's very difficult to attract doctors, and equipment is scarce and expensive to maintain. There's limited facilities in a hospital setting. So innovations in telemedicine can help make healthcare hospital development infrastructure proposals more viable to investors. And how does it do that? Next slide. So to ensure that no one is left behind, telemedicine can provide healthcare services in low resource settings. It can provide many services remotely that used to have to be done at a hospital, but because doctors may not want to be, or difficult to working conditions in remote settings, things such as telemedicine, which is a valid tool to improve healthcare of remote populations with no access to specialists. Telediagnosis are designed to enable transmission of physical examination records and medical reports remotely or concurrently to a specialist at a different or the same geographical location. Well, and then secondly is on telediagnosis. It may also enhance the diagnosis services in rural communities, thus reducing the number of referrals and optimizing human and financial resources. So next slide. Secondly is pathology. So pathology is a field of medicine that studies disease and its processes as well as diagnosis. A pathologist may examine digital slides, biopsy samples, blood draws, saliva samples, and many other test samples to diagnose a patient. Now this all can be done through telepathology, which allows pathologists to provide these diagnoses from long distances. They can look at a digital slide results or examine the test results in a lab anywhere in the world. So the other part of this equation, of course, in trying to help countries develop healthcare infrastructure in rural communities is also the ICT. Now, how do we ensure viable ICT infrastructure? There are a number of ways of doing this, and it's important because things such as telepathology and telediagnosis require a strong ICT broadband access. So to get around this, we've been exploring innovations such as Wi-Fi, and then more practical ways in also providing energy support through renewable energy and solar power to ensure that ICT infrastructure is maintained in rural and remote areas. Next slide, please. So moving ahead, infrastructure today must contribute to a carbon neutral future that contains also changing the means of production in construction materials and methods. And one of these areas is also in the area of cement. You can now put nanofibers in concrete, and that can monitor the strength of concrete, say after a disaster event such as an earthquake. So further, moreover, the Asia-Pacific region, as most of you know, is the most disaster-prone region in the world. Infrastructure must become more resilient to disasters, erratic weather extremes, and in addition, help mitigate the effects of disasters. Thus, what is needed is an unprecedented transformation of existing infrastructures to achieve the world's climate and development objectives. Next slide, please. So thus, one more slide, please. Next one. Okay. So the infrastructure financing and public-private partnerships network of Asia-Pacific, what does it do? In short, it provides PPP units, country units, and related stakeholders with enhanced knowledge to better the bankability of projects in this area and to access private financing. Next slide. Okay, so how does this all link to RCEP? The PPP network promotes resilient, sustainable domestic and cross-border infrastructure projects, as well as financing cross-border infrastructure. Thus, there is clearly a need for a strategic and coordinated regional approach to the development of cross-border infrastructure projects in Asia and Pacific. This in turn requires regional frameworks and agreements that can serve as platforms for improved connectivity and development planning, such as those envisaged along various economic corridors in the region, such as RCEP. Regional interventions such as RCEP can also support the development and adoption of common technical standards and operational rules in member states, which could do much to bring about more seamless connectivity. So the kind of multi-sectoral expertise and capacities that need to be strengthened would also benefit from shared regional learning, including the instruments and modalities by which infrastructure financing can be improved. So next slide, please. So ESCAP can play a critical role in a number of valuable ways. The pursuit of the 2030 agenda and the attainment of the SDGs requires bold steps in areas such as environmental and social sustainability, and to bring poor and less empowered communities, some of which straddle sovereign borders, into a more inclusive approach to cross-border infrastructure development spanning employment, health, land rights, human rights, and potential dislocation. And the next slide, please. So part of all our work with the network is also trying to develop sustainable infrastructure guidelines. So mobilizing public and private capital at scale for sustainable infrastructure requires first and foremost a clear understanding of what constitutes a sustainable asset and clear guidance of quantitative and qualitative indicators to be considered in the design, procurement, and executing phases. So the network guidelines aim to provide greater access to both traditional and new official sources of financing, as well as private financing that increasingly requires sustainable commitments in project development. So as an example, some of our guidelines are to also, in your project proposal, how can you, in your project, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example. So And so here the guidelines will be unveiled at our 6th PPP network meeting that will take place as an investment fair to be held on 9th December of this year. And the link is there below. And I'm hoping everyone that is a part of this conference today can join our meeting in December. So also, in Infrastructure Financing for Sustainable Development in Asia and the Pacific is our publication. It is online at our UN ESCAP website. So I encourage all of you to take a look at it, download it. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening into my presentation. And I pass the floor back to Manjiao. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for linking the infrastructure finance and PPP, sustainable development, RCEP. I believe this is a very important question that our distinguished panelists will be discussing in just a minute. So now, after the two presentations, I believe that we have those necessary background information and the questions that will guide us in our discussion. So without further ado, let me invite our panelists to discuss the core issues that has been raised, that is how to better use RCEP investment chapter, and especially the investment facilitation rules in RCEP to help boost sustainable investment and achievement of sustainable development. So just for your information, when we discuss investment facilitation, I believe every one of you would know, just for the sake of the audience, investment facilitation, broadly speaking, refers to issues that enhance the transparency and predictability of investment regimes and streamline administrative procedures. So these are the measures we're aiming for. So as we have discussed in the next part of this session, we will have some questions to each of our panelists, and we expect the panelists to share with us their insights, their expertise, and their ideas in this regard. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Sar Serena, Director of Legal Affairs Department, Counsel for the of an investment facilitation framework for development within the WTO. So that's the WTO investment facilitation framework. And also, as we said, also include a detailed provision on investment facilitation. So how do you see these provisions, the RCEP provisions, would support the WTO negotiations, and what type of technical assistance is needed in Cambodia to better use RCEP to further support investment facilitation reforms and boost the sustainable FDI? Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderators. Good afternoon from Phnom Penh to all the speakers and the presenters. And thanks, ESCAP, for having me here and have a voice. As regard to the questions, I would just wish to say a few words that if you like to connect the RCEP investment facilitation article to the WTO as one of the negotiators in RCEP, and currently following up also what's going on under the WTO, which is, I think, the latest session for the negotiation will take place soon, by the end of the year. I think the investment facilitations under RCEP is groundbreaking for the current WTO negotiation, if I may say. And it's the right time that the RCEP is going to be enforced very soon. And the WTO is going on with their effort on negotiation. And how would the RCEP investment facilitation support the WTO negotiation currently? If many of you here probably have followed up what the negotiation under the WTO, I think the WTO will be complementary to the RCEP text, because many of I can see some proponents under the WTO investment facilitations are also the signatory to the RCEP, but they have already committed to the investment facilitations in under the RCEP. So this is my view. And as regard to, in response to your question, how the ESCAP and would help, would provide a technical assistance to Cambodia in particular and to our other RCEP countries, namely, I mean, the LDC, but we are not LDC anymore, just graduate. And I would say that while negotiating the RCEP, I am also part of the legal team drafting our new investment law, which is promulgated and which is enforced on the 15th October, just a month ago, 15th October, less than a month ago, 15th October 2021. And in that new investment law, the component of the investment facilitation, including but not limited to the investment registration and the aftercare, are also part of our commitment. As our law stated that the objective of our law is to establish an open and transparent and predictable and a favorable legal framework to attract the FDI. And earlier Heather just mentioned about the advantage of the FDI. And in that particular area of the investment facilitation, we delegate, the law mandates the delegation of certain power, authority of the investment registration approval, including from the establishment stage to the aftercare to the subnational administration. And in Cambodia currently we have 25 provincial and municipal and provincial administration, and we call it subcommittee on the investments. And for that, we need we are looking for more resources to do the capacity building for those 25 subnational administration as regard to the investment promotion and the facilitation, and ranging from the procedure for the registration, approving reviewing the projects and providing the aftercare service. So these are all the huge projects that the government have to take care, and we need a lot of assistance from the stakeholder. And we, as the IPA at the central level, we have our roadmap for doing this capacity building, but I think we still need more assistance. And this is what probably you and at the ESCAP can look into. And I can talk to you personally offline if there is a contact point for me to discuss. So this is my view on the investment facilitation and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Serena, for your insights and your call for assistance in this regard. So our next panelist would be Ms. Marjorie Ramos Samaniego, Governor, Board of Investments of the Philippines. Welcome. We have a question. What are your expectations from RCEP, and how can it help support sustainable investment in ASEAN? And what are your expectations of the investment chapter, and particularly investment facilitation aspects, and what does Philippines need to realize such expectations? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Manjao, and thank you, UNESCO, for having me, and thank you also, dear speakers. Okay, RCEP investment chapter provides for actually 2 articles with respect, and it goes into articles on the promotion of investment, which is Article 10.16, and facilitation of investment and aftercare services, which is Article 10.17. These articles can actually serve as the drivers in the promotion and facilitation of sustainable investment for the Sustainable Development Goals. After all, I believe that achieving the SDG is also the aim of each and every nation and its people. So in the implementation of the RCEP provisions, more specifically, in promoting and facilitating the entry of investments, focus should be on sustainable investments, such that the nature of the investment points out to 2 or to 1 or more of the 17 SDGs. In the Philippines, for example, the economic activities that are granted incentives under our Strategic Investment Priorities Plan includes agriculture, infrastructure and logistics, manufacturing, which includes as well exports, and then innovation drivers such as research and development, renewable energy, inclusive business models, environment, and climate change related projects. And one of the parameters in the evaluation for the grant of incentives by all investment promotion agencies like the Board of Investments is actually its investment contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goal, among other government programs and plans. So the questions are, does it achieve food security? Or will the investment provide full and decent employment? Will it build resilient infrastructure and foster innovation? These are some of the elements being scrutinized upon for purposes of registration of these investments. In addition, we also have a cost-benefit analysis for each project, which we conduct, that includes the financial internal rate of return and the economic internal rate of return of that project. So these are the areas that the Philippines are doing as a way. Well, it's actually also good for the nation to have that internal SDG, but this is our initiative, and I believe it goes into the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, Manjao.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you for sharing with us the Filipino experience, which I believe will be very helpful. Our third distinguished speaker would be Mr. Said Mohd Faisal Said Mohd Dardin, Director, Investment Policy and Trade Division, Ministry of Trade and Industry of Malaysia. So, Mr. Said Faisal, I also have a question for you. What are your expectations from RCEP, and how can RCEP help support sustainable investment in ASEAN? And what are your expectations of investment chapter and investment facilitation provisions in particular? And what does Malaysia need to realize such expectations? So the questions are quite similar to that we have for Marjorie, but we would like to have your perspective from Malaysia. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And before that, I would like to thank ESCAP as well as ASEAN for providing me this opportunity. It's indeed an honor for me. Well, let me go straight to your question. I guess I address the first one first. When you talk about by saying that I think government negotiate FTAs in order to provide opportunities in a secure, predictability and stable investment, trade and investment environment. So and RCEP is no different. So basically, and on that note, basically RCEP provide RCEP objective is basically to create a liberal, facilitative and competitive investment environment in the region by complementing and building on the existing ASEAN +1 FTAs. Going to the subject of the sustainable investment in itself, I think we can hear from the presentation by Heather as well as Eric just now. I think looking at sustainable investment, sustainable development, there are myriad of sort of objective and criteria and elements. So among others that we can say that sustainable investment is a kind of investment discipline that considers, for example, sometimes in the context of environmental, social, governance, or more or less people say ESG, that generate a long-term competitive financial returns, as well as positive societal impact. I guess on that note, when you look at obviously I cannot give an example of all that elements of ESG, but if you look at the environmental impact in itself, I think RCEP is I'm interested to when I listened to Heather earlier when she said that RCEP in itself is a living document, having an investment chapter and having an investment facilitation opportunities in that agreement. Therefore, it's an opportunity for us. Even though if you look at that, while RCEP provide an investment facilitation part in that Article 10.17, but maybe there is more that we can do that with regard to, for example, safeguarding the environmental standards. So this is something that we can, in a way, something that we can do in the future. So however, on that note, I think when it comes to Malaysia, we take this opportunity to also come up with we are currently formulating what we call a new national investment policy that will based on national investment aspirations that will take ESG elements or criteria as part and parcel of what we want to have with on our national investment policy in the next in the future. Coming to the second question, whereby the expectation as how Malaysia need to realize such expectations. I think Malaysia sees RCEP investment chapter as a way to create an enabling investment environment in the region. It has all those four pillars of investment, i.e. protection, liberalization, promotion, and facilitation. This chapter, and yes, this I can echo what Senera mentioned just now. When WTO talk about investment facilitation, I think in RCEP, if I may, RCEP basically is the pioneer that embedded this or upholds such investment facilitation provision that appears in this article 10.17. Well, on investment facilitation discussion in WTO, Malaysia is also an active participation in that. So this is basically a multilateral discussion in trying to find a mutual approach and recognition on what investment facilitation per se. I'm this division called investment policy division. So when we look at investment facilitation, for example, I think technically Malaysia will always want to have a good investment facilitation, whether or not, or rather with or without an international investment agreement instrument. So we can do this unilaterally, or or you can do this by virtue of international investment agreement. On that note, for example, under this so-called, when we have the situation with respect to pandemic COVID-19, in order to facilitate investment, this ministry or the Ministry of International Trade and Industry via our investment promotion agency, which is MIDA, MIDA, we even create a specific unit called Project Acceleration Coordination Unit, or short form PACU, PACU. So this intention of this unit is to handheld all the investors in order to facilitate the investors in implementing their investment project that has been approved within a slightly quicker time frame. Well, if you are in an investment situation, most of the time it can take investment to materialize. It can take from 18 months to 24 months sometimes. So in this specific unit, we will handheld the investors in order for them to implement their investment, within the 6 months or 7 months, because we understand that especially in this situation of pandemic COVID-19, projects that we can materialize as soon as possible will be able to provide job opportunities and also other multiplier effect to continue boosting the economy, even when we have all this lockdown and stuff like that. So let me stop at that, and I think that's another question that we can answer later. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much for sharing with us the experience of Malaysia, which is also very important. So now we have our fourth distinguished panelist, Ms. Ankiti Bose, CEO and co-founder of Zilingo. Welcome. As you see, as the head of leading technology firm that has carried out FDI projects in the region, RCEP region, and as a leader in the field of using technology and sustainable fabric to drive a shift towards more sustainable supply chain in textile and garment industry. So from your perspective, how can the RCEP, especially the investment chapter, support your business and business like yours in growing its investment more in RCEP members, and what kind of domestic reforms needed in RCEP countries to encourage your company to make more investment in this country? So the floor is yours, Ankiti.
Thank you so much for having me. Truly an honor to be in the presence of all the members here. Hello everyone, my name is Ankiti. I run a tech startup which works in the field of digitizing the supply chain for fashion and textile. And of course, as you are all aware, Southeast Asia, South Asia in general are very important regions because we not only manufacture for APAC, we produce yarn, fabric, manufacture for the world. A significant part of global exports in this industry do originate from Asia and from our part of the world. I think right now we are all facing a significant challenge, but there's also an opportunity here, which is that while consumers at large and in general companies understand that there's a need to work towards sustainable goals, the governments understand it as well. There is a need for all of us to work together and work better towards those goals. And as a technology company, what we see frequently is that we don't exist in isolation, right? Tech companies don't exist in isolation. We have to work with consumers, users, businesses, small businesses, big businesses, factories, who are all transitioning from old economy to new economy. We have to work with governments, regulations, etc. Again, where there's a huge intention to move from old economy to new economy. And I think the one thing that I want to talk about today is that there's this perception that sustainability is somehow very expensive in the short to medium term, and it's useful because it's going to help us save the world in the future, which has been largely true for the last 10, 15 years. But perhaps today it's time to think about it slightly differently. So I want to talk about maybe 2 or 3 things that happen when we adopt technology widely along the supply chain. And I'll take the specific example of textile and fashion, which is a big industry in our region and employs a lot of people in our region. When we end-to-end digitize a supply chain, what ends up happening is that essentially you create transparency automatically because the middlemen are removed. The brands and the consumers can see where the products actually came from. And of course, you can actually monitor what goods went into making the products that you're actually consuming, which is not possible in the traditional supply chain where there are too many middlemen who are, creating opacity in the supply chain. So what's important is that when this digitization happens, not only are you creating transparency, not only are you obviously, ensuring a safer work environment for, workers in these countries who are working in the export hubs and the supply hubs, but also by taking away the middlemen, we're opening up margins, right? So I think that's where we have to work together. Technology companies and governments can work together to explain to, essentially manufacturers, manufacturing bases, that sustainability and transparency can actually also help the bottom line of your business if you do it the right way. If you're using software, if you're using SaaS in the future, ideally using blockchain in the supply chain. So you're creating more transparency, you're creating fairness, you're investing in ESG, but that's not necessarily hurting your profitability. That's actually helping your profitability already. And in the long run, of course, creating an infrastructure, which is extremely important, perhaps 5 years from now. So I think the key is that, working towards the awareness and adoption of technology across the supply chain together with governments as well as businesses that are old economy businesses as well as small and medium businesses, so that they can adopt technology to do it. There are, of course, second order benefits beyond just ESG and profitability. There are second order benefits like essentially once their data is entirely in the formal economy, which we can, companies like ours, not just us, companies like ours can help with. We can bring them into formal lending, financing can happen, banks can provide a credit on the back of good behavior. We can incentivize the good actors in the market and so on and so forth. So I think broadly, the focus or the perspective that we have as a technology company is that we've got to work together with regulators and around the region to make sure that the awareness and adoption of technology leads to more transparency and, of course, more financing and credit scoring, etc. But that also happens with an improved business outcome for these small and medium businesses. Otherwise, as they're emerging out of COVID, it's very hard to tell them to spend money on something just because it's sustainable. It has to tie in with their business goals as well. And I think that's sort of the intention that we want to bring to the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ankiti, for sharing with us your experience, your insights from the perspective of private industry. We will definitely benefit from that. So our next speaker would be Ms. Intan Munira Ramli, Policy Fellow, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. So you are a leading thinker and analyst of RCEP agreement. So the question is, can you reflect on what the key institutional mechanisms and measures are for enhancing sustainable investment in RCEP countries? And how is and should dispute prevention management reflected in the agreement? And what type of support can international organizations such as UN ESCAP and others to offer to the signatory countries of RCEP to help use RCEP to boost sustainable FDI? Thank you. The floor is yours, Intan.
Thank you, Manjao, and very good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to share my view coming to your questions. Of course, if you look at the recent ASEAN Joint Leader Statement, everybody acknowledged that the RCEP agreement is critical in building the region's resilience through inclusive and sustainable post-pandemic economic recovery process. And this is further contended by the presentation by Ms. Taylor Strauss in leveraging RCEP to promote sustainable FDI. So therefore, it is very much important for if RCEP comes into force next year. I think the Committee on Services and Investment, which is provided under Article 18.6 of the agreement itself, to look at what kind of key institutional mechanism and measures in enhancing sustainable investment that could be in place. So for example, one of the things that there are three things that they can actually look at is one is in terms of building the awareness and what kind of the challenges that the SDGs will have to address based on the nature of the RCEP agenda. And this is can be further been developed through initiatives by the Coordinating Committee on Investment in ASEAN, or in particular by RCEP also in terms of the Committee on Services and Investment. The second one is to ensure the commitment at the highest level with clear government commitment to the SDGs, which can be developed through the work of the RCEP Secretariat and further by the Joint Committee. And thirdly is in terms of ensuring that the leadership for the priority setting institutional arrangement among the government bodies and institution, whether it's domestically or whether it's regionally, appreciate the understanding and the importance or what can be done to the national initiatives and measures. So we see that the investment facilitation provision in the RCEP investment chapters is indeed a novel concept in this region, but somehow it signals the seriousness of this part of the region to enhance investment flows, especially given the pandemic situation. Therefore, I was rather pleased, and I think the negotiators have done a very good job in terms of ensuring the dispute prevention management are clearly provided in the agreement. So there are about several provisions that actually was about. One is establishing and maintaining the contact points, because this is basically the most important in any circumstances at all when it comes to dispute. The one-stop investment centers and the focal points also in terms of providing assistance and advisory services to investors in terms of facilitating, even though minute, small matters. The second one is provision of assistance to investors to even amicably resolve grievances with government bodies which has arisen. And this is where the importance of giving due consideration in what can be impacting the covered investment in terms of looking at resolving the difficulties experienced by investors, and nothing is small enough actually. And the third one is establishing the right mechanism to make the recommendation to the government bodies addressing recurrent issues. Sometimes licenses can be a big issue. And at the end of the day is facilitating meetings among the competent authorities, and not just exchanging knowledge, but finding ways about how to have a better resolution. So in terms of how the IOs, in terms of for UNESCO, even area, OECD or EADB and the likes, could support RCEP signatory countries. This is something I can discuss in the next leg. I think this is very important for us to roll out the understanding of what exactly is sustainable FDI indicators. I'll continue later, and I'll pass back to you, Manjao. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Intan. Thank you for the suggestions you have raised in regards to these questions. So our last speaker for this round is Mr. Darwin T. Diadiawinata, Operation and Finance Director of PT SMI Persero. So the question is, how can country infrastructure proposals become more bankable, that is, to attract green finance? And in what ways can RCEP help with this boost investment in green infrastructure? What plans does Indonesia have for using RCEP to do this? And where do you see technical assistance need to be the strongest in terms of using RCEP to boost green infrastructure investment? So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manja. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much for ESCAP for inviting me to join in this forum. Before I respond to your first question, probably I would like to introduce what is the PT-SMI actually. PT-SMI is a state-owned enterprise under the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia with a special mandate to become a catalyst for accelerating infrastructure development in Indonesia. As a non-bank financial institution and also a special mission vehicle of the government of Indonesia, we provide support for the financing and investment while also creating value-added and economic benefit to the society. The government has put us to have a strategic role as a sustainability promoter. We try to fill the gap of bankability through various and structured product and service in financing and investment that have not provided by the banks and other financial institutions. In diversifying our support for sustainable finance, we conducted innovative approach in tapping potential sources of core financing. Among others, we are the first corporate green bond issuer in Indonesia that's certified by Cicero and also established a blended finance platform SDG Indonesia 1 in 2018. I think the last platform that I mentioned is basically the answer to your question about the bankability. Under this SDG Indonesia 1, we gather national and international partners to join as an integrated plan to support sustainable development in Indonesia. SIO, as we call it, has built strategic cooperation with donors, philanthropists, bilateral and multilateral organizations, climate change fund, and universities in Indonesia through several facilities. The first facility is the development facilities. It is in the form of the technical assistant that helps for doing the due diligence, research, project development, policy support, capacity building, feasibility study, and also environmental social impact. This being supported by our partners. It can be a philanthropist or development agencies. So this is the end. This is one of the key answers on how we actually improve the bankability of the project by improving the quality of the project documents at one hand, and also how to improve the quality of the data for the project development itself. The second facility that we established under the SDG Indonesia 1 is what we call the de-risking facilities. Under this de-risking facilities, we are forming the investment grant or concessional facility, which aims to reduce the risk. This might include support for the early stage development, especially in the geothermal exploration activity. We are doing the investment premium schemes, credit enhancements, guarantees, and etc. The third facilities that we also doing after the project can be considered as bankable, so then we can conduct a partnership through what we call the financing facilities. It's a cooperation with other commercial institutions for the provision of loan to the projects. And the last part is the question is the answer to the question why the project is not really bankable. It is because the scarcity in terms of the equity. So that's why what we are establishing what we call the equity investment platform or facilities. This is the facility that we established by working with institutional investors and project developers in the provision of equity for the projects. Can be direct or can be indirect through the establishment of the fund. So that's probably the answer to the first question with regard to the bankability. By having this platform, and we can bring both public and private sector sources, we coordinate with international institutions that have special program for renewable energy project, for example, especially in the de-risking program, so that it can be offered as one of the financing facilities for our potential clients. And how this can be related with the RCEP, as she mentions, based on our experience dealing with establishment of this SDG Indonesia, at least we identify the needs from our partners. What is the needs of our partners? First, with regard to the leveraging. Our partner would like to have the contribution is being leveraged by other participations. And the second, to ensure this leveraging happening is actually both of them need to have a same perception on how to measures, on how to evaluate, and also how to report. So with that, I think my suggestion for the RCEP would be it is important for the facilitation that can be established through RCEP, can also providing a support for the aligning interests of each partners, in which later on it can help by providing the common standard for the define, measures, evaluation, and also for the reporting. So then all the partners can speak in the same language at the end. And for the last question with regards to how Indonesia can use the RCEP, I think technical assistance is actually really important. But for our priority will be the common standard reporting is actually becoming most priority at the moment, because by having those, at the end, others will speak at the same language in supporting to our effort in establishing the sustainability for each activities that we have. I think that's my answer, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darwin, for your suggestions. So now we already have our distinguished panelists, speakers to present, and then we have this idea what we need to do and what is there already. So now the next round, we will invite our panelists to share their responses, if they have, and the comments and clarifications to what has been said. I believe that would be lively and important for us in better exploring today's topic. I note that we already are a bit behind the schedule, so if I may ask our speakers to be succinct in your presentation. So in order to facilitate the presentation, I would suggest that we follow the original order of presentation. So first of all, let me invite Mr. Serena. Mr. Serena, please.
Yes. Thank you, moderator, and thank you to all presentation. I could recap that the investment facilitation is part of the component that would help us to realize the sustainable development and investment, and not just a sustainable development or investment, but I would put it another way as well, that it is responsible investments. And I couldn't agree more with what our previous speaker just intervened as regard to the sustainable is expensive. For that, I would have to, from the IPA's perspective, we need both stakeholders from the private sectors and from the public sector to involve in investment facilitation and for the sustainable development and responsible investments. And of course, in many aspects, the technical assistance are really needed to realize that spirit of investment facilitation and to achieve the sustainable development goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Serena. So our next speaker, Marjorie, would you please?
Thank you, Manjao. Okay, well, of course, one thing we can all agree on is the importance of sustainable investment and its impact on the various sustainable development goals. The speakers today have emphasized how the RCEP agreement, in particular the investment chapter, can be crucial in helping achieve these goals. To highlight again, the RCEP agreement specifically recognizes that the three pillars of sustainable investment development, namely social, economic, and environmental, are interdependent, and that economic partnerships play an integral role in promoting sustainable development goals. So in addition to this mentioned by the speakers, I would like to point out that the main objective of the RCEP investment chapter is to create a conducive investment environment for business. It has provisions to promote, facilitate, liberalize, and protect investments, which will provide investors with greater confidence to establish, maintain, and expand their business operations in the region. This will hopefully result to increase in investment, which will lead to employment opportunities and support the development of the local communities in the location in which these investments are made. The implementation of the RCEP provisions can help achieve the SDGs in the same way that achieving the SDG can help RCEP reach its fullest potential. Thus, strong global partnerships and cooperation are both necessary in the accomplishment of the SDGs, and this should also include official development assistance and support for capacity building. With this in mind, RCEP parties should collaborate to optimize the potential of the agreement by embedding mechanisms necessary to support not just investments, but more so on sustainable investments. So this should include an understanding of how, the problem is getting an understanding now of how to implement sustainable investments and facilitating entry of investments. And this is where UNESCAP would play an important role to come up with some capacity building activities to undertake this endeavor. Thank you, Manjao.
Thank you very much, Majori. So now let me turn to Mr. Said Faisal. Mr. Said Faisal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Okay, now on this particular issue of capacity building, right? So you are looking into capacity building on investment facilitation and also capacity building on sustainable FDI indicators. This is how I look at it. When you look at sustainable FDI indicators, if you look at ESG criteria, then this is not an exclusive criteria. If you look at the environmental part, or the E, there are discussion on climate change, green gas emission, resource depletion, including water. And the social part, you are talking about working condition, employee-employer relationship, diversity, etc. And on the governance part, it discusses board diversity and structure, tax strategy, and also to some extent bribery and corruption. So this is all, like I said, it's not an exclusive indicators. But perhaps these are the areas that might need assistance in identifying the elements and set the standard essentially on how to respond in addressing the issue. So we can have a reassessment of these issues in a particular, say for example, AMS, and then you look at the gap and then you find a way to address those issues. That is on the sustainable FDI, for example. When we look at investment facilitation, obviously among AMS, we are aware that recently we endorsed the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, AIFF. And also there are ASEAN countries that involve actively in the WTO Investment Facilitation Division. In both of these sort of framework and agreement, there are discussion, for example, on one-stop center, and also discussion on a single portal of investment facilitations. So these are the platform that like a lot of countries, I think, in order for the investment to be approved, for example, they involve a lot of licenses, application, etc. So this training and capacity building with respect to how to create one single portal, or how to have this not when I say one single portal, it can be one-stop center physically and also a single portal online, a website that an investor can go in and then everything is there, with respect to regulation, laws, licenses, etc. So these are those areas that may need to be is very important, because it will ensure communication and linkages within, we have many ministries, investment promotion agencies that help facilitate investors. Therefore, such capacity building on this part will definitely assist countries in responding to the investment facilitation intention of this agreement. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you very much. So now we turn to Ms. Ankiti Bose. The floor is yours.
Hi. I'll keep it short. I think in terms of the investment that is required, at least from our point of view, to make the supply chain much more resilient and sustainable requires some basic sort of infrastructure on the operational side, which is around interoperability. Right now, especially majority of the supply chains that we see or we work with in this region are heavily involved in exports, and many are, of course, heavily involved in imports as well. And there's a lot of intra-ASEAN, intra-Asia trade that happens. There is definitely, to create more sustainability and more transparency in that supply chain, what we definitely need is interoperability in terms of logistics, in terms of interoperability in terms of payments, interoperability in terms of financing, interoperability in terms of data, which means that to create true transparency, we need to invest in infrastructure that actually can make sense across the whole supply chain as different parties across the supply chain actually sort of work together. Actually that has benefits even beyond sustainability and transparency. It perhaps will help us all solve for or reduce the supply chain breaks that we are facing in this part of the world right now. So I think those are maybe the 2 or 3 actionable things that we can work on.
Thank you very much, Ankiti. So now we turn to Ms. Intan Murinra Ramli. Intan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manjau. Okay, when we look at the several points on capacity building needs, basically we look at bridging the implementation gap, strengthening the country's capacities, developing or enhancing skills, and setting up the conducive environment for investors. But what I want to highlight is about the importance of putting in place effective mechanisms and processes in settlement of complaints and grievances. Because when one talk about putting in place effective mechanism processes, this is just not about putting the institution, which I think a lot of countries already have the institution, but the actual understanding on the whole processes in facilitating the investors' needs, grievances, which include even at the need about reforming the related investment policies, rules and regulations. And from my observation working in ASEAN for quite some time, I see that ASEAN LDC somehow will need more capacity building support and training for the better implementation of investment facilitation measures. And having those lack of resources for recovery also may make them somehow hard to compete and find a way to reform this FDI approach. And listening from the proposal by presented by Heather is that in terms of what basically could be presented by, could be done by IO such as ESCAP, like capacity building on sustainable development investment provision. I think this is very important because and should be done not just by ESCAP also, and can be done also by other related IOs in terms of understanding the provision as enumerated in the RCEP agreement and how it can be implemented and benefited by the RCEP signatory countries, and technical assistance on investment facilitation. This is important in terms of to develop the aftercare packages for the investors and to even work out the clear working processes for investment agencies, because these are basically where the buck stops. And on technical assistance on sustainable FDI indicators, like what Heather said, a lot of people do not understand exactly what is FDI indicators, and this is very important to actually inculcate and actually in terms of looking at how to implement and the methodology itself, to even developing the related policies. And lastly, the intergovernmental platform provided in for dialogue and exchanges, which can be introduced by also RCEP Committee on Services later. It's very important in terms of investment opportunities and awareness. So all in all, having those good understanding, ability to implement good and sustainable FDI policies, I think that this is somehow will build the reputation of this region and somehow attract capital, staying ahead of regulatory requirements and ability to manage these risks from ESG issues and obtaining the real value and better terms. With that, I would like to close and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Intan. So last but not least, let's invite Mr. Darwin for his responses and comments. Darwin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. With RCEP, we expect that it can help to build a sustainable finance ecosystem through active participation in members in promoting ESG, SDG, and also the ESS, environmental social standard. So with them, we can learn to each other. RCEP can be a reference that reflected from the interaction of the members within the domestic and the international partners, as well as from the experience that members have in dealing with the implementation of that framework. Through collaboration on capacity building, NTA, it can support the better project development, providing inputs for better financing structure, as well as aligning the interests of stakeholders participating in the, especially in the sustainable project or green projects. We hope that under this facilitation, members could take a role such as in funding mobilization, including the concessional loan facilities, de-risking, project preparation grants, or technical assistance. With that, thanks to you, Pak.
Thank you very much, Darwin. Thanks a lot. At this point of time, I would like to invite our audiences to raise your hands if you have any questions at this point of time. So I already note, while you probably are thinking of these questions, I already note that there is a request for intervention. We have Julia Puno, APRN, would like to intervention. So Julia, would you please identify yourself? And yes, please.
Thank you so much, Manjao. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our speakers. And thank you, ESCAP, for organizing this event. I am Julia from Asia Pacific Research Network and also Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism, RCEP. And we would like to deliver our intervention regarding the topic of RCEP. So we think the conclusion of RCEP comes at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic crisis is being used as a pretext for new neoliberal reforms or policies and for accelerating existing ones. RCEP will usher in a new era of free trade, a milestone for corporate elites to celebrate. For much of the Asia-Pacific population, however, we think that it is yet another cross to bear. We think that its abolition is a just cause to fight for, as it will only widen inequalities, further drag the vulnerable into abject poverty, and give rise to human rights violations. RCEP, through its hand at tailoring environmental regulations, intellectual property rights, and dispute settlement mechanisms, will tip the scales in the favor of the private sector. In workers' rights, for example, increased loans with attached conditionalities aimed at trade liberalization, privatization, and the regulation of public assets and services in the guise of COVID-19 response will be orchestrated by international financial institutions. This will impose cheap labor and ignore international standards of working conditions. This can create an environment hostile to collective bargaining and exercise of labor rights, as well as foster conditions that enable widespread contractualization and mass layoffs. As RCEP enables the reduction of import tariffs, the local agriculture sector will also be largely affected, as well as the influx of cheaper foreign products will affect locally produced products. To give way to foreign investments, land grabbing and environmental damage will be a direct effect to rural areas, and thus further militarization of rural and indigenous peoples' communities will be rampant, leading to more cases of human rights violations as people struggle for their home, livelihood, and ancestral domain. Through intellectual property rights, RCEP can allow giant pharmaceutical companies and agri-corporations to rake in profits at the expense of people's access to affordable healthcare and seats, as RCEP provides for the extension of pharmaceutical patents, more stringent data exclusivity, and allows for private players to sidestep national laws on public health safety nets. It also has a provision for eliminating the production of generic medicine in the market. It is therefore unsurprising why Asia-Pacific countries such as India opted out of the deal, citing its possible adverse effects to its local industries, and why Thailand was reluctant at the beginning. The pandemic did not stop the proponents of RCEP in fast-tracking the deal as meetings continued in a virtual setting. This makes further sense if juxtaposed with the fact that China is currently in a tariff war with the US and is maneuvering to expand its economic and political power in the region. Which countries stand to gain the most in RCEP, with China as the biggest winner, while developing countries risk losing whatever little control they have over their local industries? Above all else, the pandemic has exposed the need for countries to fix their own defective systems of social services in healthcare, education, social insurance, among others, to better cope with the crises. COVID-19 has exposed the need to build self-reliance among nations. By joining RCEP, countries that are already in a debt crisis with poor systems of social services and without genuinely independent basic industries will only have a wider chasm between the rich and the poor. Needless to say, we think that RCEP imposes a threat to people's rights. Thus, it is imperative that stakeholders, governments, and other institutions such as ESCAP take a closer look at how this trade deal will drastically affect the landscape of trade not only in their countries but in the region. There is a need to enable effective engagement mechanisms that are inclusive and accessible, especially to marginalized sectors, civil society organizations, and people's movements to shape the kind of framework that is needed to address the realities they face and provide solutions to their needs. Grassroots sectors such as farmers, workers, and indigenous peoples, among others, should be at the core of decision-making processes and not businesses. We shouldn't go back to business as usual if it only means further excluding the voices of the people. Now more than ever, efforts should be made for countries to shape their own economies based on the needs of their people, espouse people-centered development such as genuine agrarian reform, sustainable production, and consumption, as well as to independently decide their own path to development through national policies and investing in their local industries. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia, for your intervention. So at this point of time, I think it's we are a few minutes. I think a few minutes later, but that's fine. Let me very briefly wrap up before I hand it over to Ronnie. So in the past 2 hours, I believe we have enjoyed tremendously what has been discussed here. We have discussed the issue, the very important issue of how to use RCEP and RCEP investment chapter investment facilitation provisions in particular to better promote sustainable FDI in the region and beyond. We have the opportunity to have the panelists from different backgrounds and policymakers, private industries, academics, and then we have identified, I believe, quite a few questions where further efforts need to be made. On the one hand, we share the idea that the capacity building, national reform measures, and assistance from international organizations such as ESCAP itself are very much needed in order to address this issue. And at the same time, we also sense the need that RCEP need to be better institutionalized, and future negotiations probably is also needed in order to better make RCEP working towards the end of promoting sustainable investment. So thank you very much to our distinguished speakers and panelists and the guests and also the audience for joining today's session. I hope you have enjoyed it, and thank you very much. So now I would like to hand it over to Mr. Rumat Surakosuma, Head Sub-Regional Office for Southeast Asian ESCAP, for a closing remark. Ronnie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Manjao, for your excellent moderation. And that concludes session 6 of the FSDG Forum for today. Again, permit me to express our great appreciation to all the distinguished panelists for their contribution of their views and ideas on the subject matter that I believe will become an important topic for the signatories of RCEP as well as the success of the agreement itself. This is definitely a new level of economic cooperation and integration agreement that has the potential to contribute to the COVID-19 recovery efforts in Southeast Asia and beyond. I fully concur with the assessment of Manjao, as well as the insights of the participants on the sustainable FDI or responsible investment. It's definitely everyone's concern, including all stakeholders, not only of government, but also the private sector, and the CSOs who are also present at this event. There's also a need for RCEP as a living document to develop further, not only by the RCEP signatories, but all institutions and all stakeholders. We also mentioned that capacity need by all the countries in terms of the understanding of the processes, institutionalizations mechanism is also a responsibility for all stakeholders in order to ensure that not only that RCEP, particularly the investment chapter, is successful, but also implemented in accordance to the benefit for all the people. So with that, the deliberation of this session, as well as other sessions, will be reported to the 9th Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development that will be scheduled 28th to the 31st of March of 2022 as part of the perspectives and priorities of Southeast Asia on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And we hope that the situation next year will permit all of us in order to meet in person. As a final note, allow me to repeat Ibu Arbida's statement of 2020 that remains relevant, and that is to recover better, stronger, and smarter, countries must prioritize social protection, digitalization, and a green recovery for post-pandemic recovery and beyond. Policy areas and strategic interventions must also be in line with the principles of inclusion, resilience, and sustainability. I would also like to reiterate Thailand's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Don Pramudai's call to rebuild a better world while accelerating SDG advancement and the need to abandon the business as usual mentality to bring about a development pathway that is also inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So with that, may I now bring the 5th Southeast Asia Multi-Stakeholder Forum to a close. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.